Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaeological. Today is the second video in a six-video series I'm doing on some of the great civilizations in the history of Africa. I have to make a slight correction. Previous video, I said I was doing seven. My math was off. I am actually doing six. With that out of the way, the subject of today's video is the Kingdom of Axum and its rule in classical East Africa and Arabia. This kingdom has oftentimes been known as the fourth great power of late antiquity. So, as I'm sure many of you watching this know, many of you are very familiar with the phrases like Arabia and East Africa. And as I'm always as I always like to do, whenever I bring up phrases of geographic regions and countries and things like that, like the United States or, you know, ancient China or Arabia and East Africa, I like to point out how whenever we in our modern minds hear these phrases, we tend to think of them as the way they are now, which is not incorrect at all. After all, this is how we've known them for decades or perhaps even a couple of hundred years. However, that is not the full picture. For example, East Africa and Arabia only became, uh, specifically East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, only became the shapes they are today, only took on the borders and shapes of countries and such that they have today after a long series of processes and events. So, in order to better understand how these regions and countries, etc., became the shape they are today, we need to go back a little bit into the past to get a look at the bigger picture. But before we get into the bulk of the video, I feel it is important to define the term late antiquity, because I'm sure many of you are asking, what exactly is late antiquity? Like, what does that mean? Well, late antiquity is the time period roughly, and I consulted some friends of mine who are archaeologists and historians who specialize in this time period. So late antiquity is very nebulously and sometimes not always necessarily put at this in this sort of box, but late antiquity is nebulously the time period between 200 and around 500 CE or AD. So essentially, right as the great civilizations of Rome and China and India and Persia and such were collapsing or were going into transition periods or what have you. Right at so is to give you another good definition, it's the time period from again around 200 to 500 CE or AD, right up until the beginning of the early medieval period, which begins around 476 to 500 CE or AD. So, all right. So now that we've defined what exactly late antiquity is, or well, sorry, not what exactly it is, because of course there's some debate, but the general idea of what late antiquity is. Now we are going to take a look at the what is essentially what we call the Horn of Africa and Southwest Arabia, specifically the origin of agriculture and animal domestication in the Neolithic period of both of these regions. So this is a map just generally giving you an idea what these regions are. The Horn of Africa is generally thought of or defined as the region of Africa consisting of Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, and Somalia. And it's called the Horn of Africa because it looks like a rhinoceros horn. And then, of course, Southwest Arabia is generally the southwestern part of Saudi Arabia, as well as the southwestern part of Oman, and essentially all of the country of Yemen. So, beginning anywhere between 12,000 years ago to around 9,000 years ago, groups of people began to migrate into Africa and intermarry with groups who had already pre-existing groups within Africa. And when they migrated, they began depositing new language groups, specifically the Afro-Asiatic and Semitic languages that you see here, with some of the pre-existing language groups, including the Beja language group that you see here. Also, in this region, languages spoken in this region at the onset of the Neolithic and to this day include languages such as the Nilotic languages and the Cushitic languages. So, agriculture and animal domestication actually began first in southwest Arabia, happening somewhere around 6,455 to 2,872 BCE. And when this happened, the peoples of southwestern Arabia domesticated animals like cattle and began to develop agriculture based around crops such as wheat and barley and millet. Sorghum and sorghum. And then they would be followed shortly after by the peoples of the Horn of Africa, who would, much like Southwest Arabia, start developing agriculture around barley and wheat. And then they would also domesticate animals like cattle and various equinid animals, such as donkeys and horses. And this brings us to our next section, Egyptian expeditions to the land of Punt between 2500 and 980 BCE. So, for much of the history of the Horn of Africa, the peoples of the Horn of Africa had some degree of contact with the Egyptian civilization that you see here. Throughout the history of ancient Egypt, various Egyptian dynasties, especially the New Kingdom dynasty, of which is famous for having pharaohs like Tutankhamun and Ramesses the Great, would send military and trade expeditions via land as well as via sea to this land that they mentioned in the text called the land of Punt, seen here. Most of the time they would send it via sea, via boat, as you see here, but they would, as you see on this map and in this engraving, this mural in a temple, would also send land expeditions. And what they would go there for, various different exotic items. These items included, but were not limited to, things like gold, because the land of Punt was described as being very rich in gold. They would also go for incenses and resins such as frankincense and myrrh, as well as aromatic woods such as ebony wood. And then they would gather up all these trade goods, throw them onto the ships, and sell right back up the Red Sea to Egypt, to essentially disperse them through various high status individuals, and of course to the royal families and pharaohs. Now you might be asking, how do we know that the Horn of Africa was the land of Punt? Like, where is the land of Punt? Well, for starters, various Egyptian murals and texts describe in great detail the types of animals that were native to the land of Punt. And they mention things, animals that include but are not limited to giraffes, hippos, leopards, and the one that we're going to look at specifically for this video, baboons and other types of monkeys. So our best evidence for where the land of Punt comes from. It comes from archaeological evidence as brought forward by this paper titled Mummified Baboons Reveal the Far Reach of Early Egyptian Mariners by Nathaniel J. Dominy et al. And in this paper, Dominy and his colleagues, or her colleagues, depending on how they view themselves, looked at various different lines of evidence. They looked at murals, as you see here, depicting various baboons and things like that. Some at, for example, the one of the temples built by Ramesses II, and things like that. And they start noticing in these murals that the baboons in these murals and carvings and statues and such match more closely to the type of the species of baboons that exist in and around the Horn of Africa. And this is further backed up by the discovery of mummified baboons in New Kingdom Egypt, as well as in Ptolemaic Egypt, which allows the Dominy and et al., Dominy and their colleagues, to genetically test the remains of these baboons, which placed the origin of these baboons to, you guessed it, the Horn of Africa, as well as the adjacent area outside of the Horn of Africa. And here's a graph of some of that genetic evidence and testing you see here. So it is pretty clear that the land of Punt was the Horn of Africa, and that it was a very important trade partner with the ancient Egyptian civilization. And eventually, in the so-called land of Punt, a kingdom known as the Kingdom of Damit, or Damet, would arise. Now, I should clarify that there's another much later kingdom that would arise during the medieval period, around the 1200s CE and AD, that it was also called Damet or Damat. So don't get those two confused. But so the first kingdom of Damet would arise around 900 BCE and would last till around 400 BCE. And it would arise right around this area of the Ethiopia in the Horn of Africa. And here's some of the sites that are associated with this kingdom. And it would be placed somewhere around the pre-Aksumite, early pre-Aksumite time period. And what's interesting about this kingdom is archaeological evidence has found evidence of some degree of influence on the kingdom or the chiefdom, what have you, of Damet by the Sabian culture of the southwestern Arabian Peninsula. And this can be seen in a variety of different ways, such as Sabian inscriptions in Ethiopia and in Eritrea, dating to around 900 BCE, as well as the presence of religious centers dedicated to Arabian deities such as Atar. Now, I do apologize to anyone from Arabia and anyone who's an Arabian specialist for possibly butchering the name of this deity. Eventually, though, Damet would fall in the 5th century BCE, leading to the plateau to come to be dominated by very small different successor kingdoms, which would last until around the 1st century BCE, when the Aksumite kingdom would rise to dominate the rest of these successor kingdoms. Which leads us to our next section, the Kingdom of Axum, which rose and lasted from around 150 BCE to 960 CE. So the the Kingdom of Axum would rise from the Iron Age Proto-Aksumite period, and would eventually be based around the city known as, you guessed it, Axum, model of which is here, and the ruins of which are seen here. And actually, the first historical mention of Axum comes from the Roman sort of trade guide, geography book, what have you, known as the Periplus of the Erethian Sea, which dates from around the mid-first century CE or AD. And Axum in this trade guide is mentioned alongside the cities of Adulis and Ptolemais. And Ptolemais of the Hunts is lying within the realm of Zoskalis. After its rise, in 100 BCE, after a couple of hundred years, the Aksumite kingdom would begin to expand gradually through conquest, essentially going north, west, and southwest through into Ethiopia and into northern Sudan, conquering various different smaller kingdoms and tribal groups, all the way up to the Aswan area, as you see here. And of course, they would eventually go and conquer their rival, or at least defeat and overthrow their rivals, the Kushites. And this would happen because right around the same time the kingdom of Axum was expanding outwards. Excuse me. The kingdom of Axum would become a powerful political and trade rival to the Meroitic kingdom of Kush, which you can see here, which was in itself already starting to go into a period of decline. So eventually, during the reign of the Aksumite emperor or king Azania, Azania would then launch a devastating war and military campaign onto the kingdom of Kush. Now, he would say that he would claim that the campaign was directed primarily against the Nova or the Nobate, a subgroup within the kingdom of Kush, a nomadic subgroup in the kingdom of Kush, and he would direct this military campaign against them in response to the kingdom of Kush's inability to deal with earlier raids and such on Axum by the Nobate, by the Noba. And so, because of that, that's why he would launch this campaign. But keep in mind, while he made that claim, Azania's invasion would lay waste not just to the lands of the Nova, the Nobate, but also would destroy Kushite territory as well, and eventually would end in the sacking of the Kushite capital of Meroe, which would effectively end Kushite hegemony. And this would all happen in 350 CE. And then Azania would proceed to commission a stela known as the Azania Stone, with languages written in the languages of Gez, the state language of Axum, Greek, and Sabaean, commemorating his victory over the kingdom of Kush. Which personally leads me to believe that the whole idea that he was attacking specifically because of the Nova, the Nobate, was only a pretense. Like, I'm sure that was part of the reason, but it was by no means, at least in my opinion, the main reason. And here's the Azania Stone you see here. And because after the Aksumite expansion and conquest of much of Ethiopia and southern Sudan, and the Aksumite defeat and usurpation of the kingdom of Kush, eventually various different political figures and prophets and such as the prophet and founder of Manichaeism, Mani, would go on to declare the kingdom of Axum as one of the so-called great powers of the time period, placing it alongside the Sasanian Empire, or the Sassanid Empire, as it's also called, the Roman Empire, and Han China. And Mani and these other figures would make this claim around the late 3rd century CE, so around the late 200s CE or AD. And so here's maps of some of those great powers that you see here: Rome, the Sassanid Empire, and then the Eastern Han Dynasty, and then, of course, the Kingdom of Axum. All right, so now that we have covered the Kingdom of Axum's rise, its early history as the land of the Kingdom of Damit and the land of Punt, as well as its Neolithic period, it is now time for us to take a look at the culture, architecture, and economy of the Kingdom of Axum. Starting with the language and literature that existed within this kingdom. So, as I alluded to just a little bit earlier, the state language of the Kingdom of Axum was a language and writing system known as Gez. And they would use this language to write various different forms of literature, of course, inscribe on stelae such as the Azania stone, as well as to eventually write in things like Bibles. And such as you see here, and we'll cover why that is in just a little bit, specifically right now, leading us to the next section, religion in the Kingdom of Axum. So, from around 150 BCE to 325 CE, the Kingdom of Axum was primarily polytheistic in religion, venerating primarily South Semitic deities such as Atar, Almaka, and Dat Badan. Again, apologies to anyone from Southwestern Arabia and anyone who specializes in Southwestern Arabian archaeology and history for possibly butchering those. But eventually, by 325 CE, the Kingdom of Axum would go on to adopt Coptic Christianity during the reign of King Azania. Now, this was done for a few reasons. Mainly, it was done because during that period of time, much of Rome, including the rulership, had converted Christianity. So, really, this conversion seems to have been more of a conversion of convenience than anything. And there's a lot of evidence for this, mainly that while Azania would send out letters and other things and coins showing that he and his royal court and things like that were Christian to the Roman Empire and such, books and coins and things that he would disperse amongst his populace still had very polytheistic elements, and oftentimes still had some degree of veneration towards gods like Atar in them. But they would eventually, despite this, eventually the Kingdom of Axum would become completely Christian. Now we go into our next section. What did trade look like in the Kingdom of Axum? Well, the Kingdom of Axum, after its defeat of the Kingdom of Kush, and also a little bit before, would eventually become a key player in the Indo-Roman trade network that you see here on this map from the aforementioned trade guide known as the Periplus of the Eritrean Sea. With specifically the Aksumite city of Adulis becoming the main port, the main trade entrepot for Aksumite participation in this trade network. Again, especially after the defeat of the Kingdom of Kush. And the main trade goods the Kingdom of Axum would export during this time period would be raw materials such as ivory, which would go on to be carved into things like you see here, tortoise shells, and gold. In fact, what's interesting is ivory from Axum has been found much farther away than you might think. This paper came out titled Ivory from Early Anglo-Saxon Burials in Lincolnshire, a biomolecular study by Katie A. Himmer et al. And in this paper, Himmer et al. Mentions how they discovered ivory bag rings, and girdle hangers in this Anglo-Saxon context. And upon doing the analysis, the molecular and chemical analysis and things like that, they found that the ivory associated with the skeleton, one dated to around 428 and to 598 CE or AD, and also indicated that the ivory came from extant or still living elephant species rather than extinct elephant species, and specifically that they came from African elephants rather than, say, Asian elephants. And upon doing their even more uh, analysis of the chemicals and things like that, and genetics and such, they came to the conclusion that the most likely origin of this ivory, these ivory rings, comes from the Kingdom of Axum. So that means that the Kingdom of Axum was exporting goods as far north as England, and then, of course, as far east is India. So they had a pretty wide reach, albeit indirectly, but still a very wide reach. In return for the exportation of these goods, such as ivory, the Kingdom of Axum would then import goods such as silk from China, spices from India, and glass objects from Rome. Which actually leads us to our next section, diplomatic relationships of the Kingdom of Axum. So, as their conversion to Christianity and the importation of glass goods implies, the Kingdom of Axum would have very close ties, very close to diplomatic ties with the Roman and then the succeeding Byzantine empires. And this can be seen in a variety of different evidences, such as Roman missionaries, such as Frumentius, becoming teachers for Aksumite royalty, as well as the letters that were exchanged between Roman emperors such as Constantius II to the kings of Axum. And then, of course, later on, the Kingdom of Axum would help the Byzantine Empire, specifically during the reign of Justinian I, on several different military campaigns. Then also, as seen in the Sabaean descriptions and the worship of southwestern Arabian deities, the Kingdom of Axum would maintain close but admittedly very mixed political connections to the kingdoms of the southwestern Arabian Peninsula, such as the Kingdom of Himyar, and would also hold, the Kingdom of Axum would also hold varying degrees of influence over the states in the northwestern region of Nubia or Sudan. Or the Sudan, so i.e. holding varying degrees of influence over the cultures such as the Nobatier, the Blimis, and the Eladia, and things like that, and people like that. And then lastly, the Kingdom of Axum would have mixed and often very antagonistic relations with the Persian Sassanid Empire, and we will cover the relations with the Sassanid Empire and the Kingdom of Himyar in just a little bit. Now we're going to the next section, the architecture of the Kingdom of Axum. So the Kingdom of Axum has several examples of very advanced and very beautiful architecture that was created during the existence of the kingdom, and these include, but are not limited to, things like rock-hewn churches that you see here, various different elaborate palaces, water spouts in the shape of lion heads, tombs beneath various stelae fields, as well as the very famous tomb of the false door. And then, as the tomb under the stelae fields implies, the most famous and most well-known types of Aksumite architecture are the very numerous stelae erected during the kingdom's existence, with varying degrees of I don't want to necessarily say sophistication, but with varying degrees of detail, with some being as detailed as these you see here, and then some being generally just rocks and things like that you see here that were stood up or carved out. And now we move on to the last subsection of the technology, trading, and economy section of the Kingdom of Axum, the currency of the Kingdom of Axum. And as you can see here, the Kingdom of Axum was mainly a coin-based economy, and the coins had varying degrees of of detail and quality, with some being very high quality, as you see here, and then some being a little rougher quality, and then some, of course, as I mentioned earlier in the religion part, some had Christian iconography, especially later on, while some had pagan iconography or polytheistic iconography. Now this leads us to our next section, the Aksumite invasion of the southwestern Arabian Himyarite kingdom, and the Aksumite Persian Wars. So in 520 CE, the current king of Axum, Caleb, would send a military expedition against the Jewish king of Himyar, Du Nuwas Yusuf, who was persecuting the Christian community within his kingdom. And after much fighting, Caleb's soldiers would eventually rout Yusuf's forces and kill the king of Himyar, which would then allow Caleb to appoint a native Christian as his viceroy of the kingdom, with Aksumite direct control of Himyar continuing for about 5 years. But eventually in 525, the puppet viceroy of Himyar would be deposed by one of Caleb's generals, Abra, with support from Ethiopians who had previously settled in the region of Yemen that was ruled by Himyar. And in response, Caleb would send 2 expeditions against Abra, but both would be decisively defeated. After this, Caleb would decide, let's cut our losses, let's not push it too much. I've already lost a couple of expeditions. And so he would recognize Abra as his new viceroy. And this would lead South Arabia to become an Aksumite protectorate under Abra and his son Masruk for around 4 decades, from roughly 530 to 570 CE. After Abra's death, his son Masruk ibn Abra would continue the Aksumite viceroyalty in Yemen, but would actually eventually end the joint Himyarite Aksumite kingdom and would actually do what his father refused to do and annex the kingdom of Himyar into the Aksumite kingdom itself. But following these events, Masuk's half-brother, Mad Karib, apologies for possibly butchering that, would revolt against him. But he would do this while he was revolting against his brother Masuk. Mad Karib would look for some help because, of course, he understood he couldn't deal with Masuk or the kingdom of Axum by himself. So first he went to the Byzantine Empire, but they would say no, presumably because they had very close connections with the kingdom of Axum. So after being rejected by the Byzantine Empire, Mad Karib would seek help from Khosrow I, the ruler of the Sassanid Persian Empire. So before we get into that conflict that had just begun between the kingdom of Axum and the Sassanid Persian Empire, we first need to take a look at on how the soldiers and weapons looked in both of these, the militaries of both of these powers. So, starting off, soldiers in the kingdom of Axum at this period in time generally looked something like this, like you see here. They were infantry and such, and oftentimes they did ride elephants. They were from Africa. Many civilizations at the time used elephants from Africa and Asia, so it's not too surprising. And soldiers from the kingdom of Axum and from southwestern Arabia would generally be equipped with swords that looked something like this, with some degree of variation, with spears, and would be equipped with the traditional Ethiopian and Nubian hand bow that you see here. Then, of course, they would have various different types of arrows that they would use in conjunction with this, and then this is one of their quivers. The Sassanid Persian soldiers, on the other hand, were a little bit different. One, they were by and large primarily cavalry-based military, relying on horses and heavy cavalry and light cavalry. But they also too used elephants, and more specifically Asian elephants. And the weapons that they were equipped with were, one, they used spears, generally looking very similar to, though of course some degree of variation to, the ones used by the Kingdom of Axum and Himyar. But they also used various different types of maces, like you see here. The type of bow that the Sassanid soldiers used was the Eurasian composite bow, or recurve bow. Uh, After all, many Sasanian cavalry came from the Eurasian steppe. They used swords generally of this design as well. All right, so now that we have gotten what the soldiers of both sides looked like and the types of weapons they used out of the way, let's move on to the conflict, the so-called Sassanid Aksumite Wars. So the Sassanids would invade southwestern Arabia, Himyar, Yemen, whatever you want to call the region, and would defeat the Kingdom of Axum in several battles, and would eventually annex Himyar, the region of Himyar or Yemen, into the Sassanid Empire, roughly somewhere between 570 to 578 CE or AD. However, right around, and this is up for debate. No one's really sure which of these 2 years is correct, whether it was 575 or 578 CE, but somewhere around this time period between 575 and 578 CE, the Sassanid Persian garrison would withdraw from Yemen, and in response to this, Aksumite men and soldiers would kill the current Sassanid ruler or satrap or viceroy. I've heard it called all three of those terms. Essentially assassinate him, and would retake Himyar for the Kingdom of Axum. In response to this, the Sassanids would send a force of around 4,000 men, and would manage to successfully defeat and reconquer Himyar / Yemen, and then would proceed to install a new satrap, ruler, viceroy for the province. And this brings us to our next section, the decline and fall of the Kingdom of Axum. After all, nothing can last forever. So Axum would begin its decline due to a variety of factors. One, of course, due to the defeats at the hands of the Sassanid Persian Empire, but also because of several military defeats at the hands of the rising Islamic Caliphates. These caliphates including the ones started by Muhammad himself, and then Abu Bakr, and then the Rashidun Caliphate, and then the Umayyad Caliphate, and the Abbasid Caliphate. In fact, Muhammad himself would send military expeditions against the Aksumite city of Adulis. Furthermore, as these caliphates began to rise, they would very quickly seize control of the Red Sea trade network from the Kingdom of Axum, meaning the Kingdom of Axum would lose a valuable part of its economy. All of this together, the defeats at the hands of the Sassanid Persians and the Muslim Caliphates, the Islamic Caliphates, as well as the loss of control of their one of the key parts of their economy, the trade network of the the Red Sea, would leave the Kingdom of Axum susceptible to both outside attack and internal division. And this in itself would would climax in the attack on Axum by the Jewish queen Judith, also known as Gudit or Judith, who would invade and attack Axum and would proceed to demolish churches, monasteries, as well as buildings that she viewed were committing Christian iconoclasm. She would also kill the last king of Axum, who was possibly named Dil-Naold, causing the displacement of the Aksumite population into the south. They would eventually build a new capital, but eventually, because they had been weakened so much, the kingdom of Axum would fall somewhere around 960 CE. Now, this leads us to our last section, the legacy of the kingdom of Axum. Well, despite collapsing in 960 CE, and because despite a short dark age, a new kingdom would actually arise in Ethiopia somewhere around the 11th and 12th century CE, most likely around 1137 CE, known as the Kingdom of Zagwe, or the Zagwe dynasty, who would claim inheritance and descent from the Kingdom of Axum, and would build various different works and things like that. However, this kingdom was limited in size and was fairly short-lived, is because only 100 fairly short-lived because only 100 years later, the last king of Zagwe would be killed in battle in 1270 CE, which ends our video. So we've just heard about and seen a powerful African kingdom that was able to rise up and become an equal of the Roman Empire and other empires such as China and the Sassanid Empire, which is something that not a lot of people hear about. This was truly, even though they fell from grace, the fourth great power of late antiquity. So with that, I hope you all enjoyed the video. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And if you want to see me cover any of the things I mentioned in the video in greater detail later, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And you all have a good day.